Well, good evening to you all. Well, give it up for Frank one more time. He's old and he needs that encouragement. I thank you. Now, my Christian name is Frank. And I say that to you because I want you to know that I am a Christian. I am as God-fearing a man as has ever toiled this earth. But from the stories I'm about to tell, that might not seem too obvious. Yeah, true, I may not be able to recite the good book chapter and verse like the Right Reverend Bishop Kemp, but I believe what my heart tells me. And my heart tells me that the spirit is pure and whole, no matter what sorry state the body happens to be in. It's awful morbid thinking, to be sure, but then, well, I have an awful morbid tale to tell. And I first came to Baltimore when I was a right young lad. My kinfolk came from Ireland, taking passage on the Atlantic to avoid the famine. Now, I was just a babe in swaddling clothes, too young to remember the voyage, too young to remember my mother dying on board from the scurvy. But I grew up fast, learning what I could from a Sunday school reader and from a queer little healing book my father had given me. Keep it, Frank, he said. Read it and heed its knowledge when your humors are low. The reaper's not to be having any more of our kinfolk here in America. We've done paid him our debt. Well, I spent many an evening fingering the brittle pages of that little book. Father used to catch me late at night sitting up reading by the light of a single candle. And he'd laugh as he'd say, "Studying to be a doctor already, laddie? If only I could get you to tend to your chores the way you tend to that book. Now put out that candle before you set us all aflame. There'll be plenty of time for you to practice your healing." The last career in medicine was not to be. No, we were too poor to afford the learning, you see. Besides, medicine was for the dandies and the aristocrats, not for the commonality. Instead, the good Lord blessed me with a hearty pair of hands, and I went to work at the Baltimore Brickworks, and from there I took a job with the building construction firm of Towson and Mosher. It was in 1811 that I started work on a very strange building, Davidge Hall, first building in the new University of Maryland Medical School. Well, as I say, it's an odd building. Two rounded domes built one on top of the other with no visible means of support. The bottom theater was Chemical Hall, the top theater Anatomical Hall. Well, many of the state's finest physicians were there, milling around, observing the construction, and I became acquainted with one of them, Dr. Nathan Reno Smith. He treated a broken toe I got when a brick fell off a scaffold. Well, as this construction progressed, I became curious about an unusual spiral staircase in the rear of the hall that led to a secret entrance. Having struck up somewhat of a friendship with Smith, I asked him about it. I said, "Is it a secret escape route in case the British attack?" He said, no, we have enemies on our own shores from whom we have to protect ourselves. And then he said, "Frank, why don't you come with me to the Crumbles Inn? We'll have some supper and drinks." And since he agreed to pay, I agreed to go. That was the relationship we had. And once there, Smith began to talk in generous detail about the medical profession. He said, "You know, Frank, on the one hand, the law insists that a surgeon possess the skills necessary to practice his vocation and be subject to criminal proceedings at the whim of a dissatisfied patient. But on the other hand, the only way of acquiring these skills is through dissection, which is itself a crime, punishable by law." I looked at him and I said, "I think the law's an ass." I think he liked that. And then he got an odd look on his face. He started to lean forward. At first I thought it was gas, but it wasn't. You see, he started to talk. Just then, two people walked past our table. He stopped, waited for them to go by. Then he asked me what he wanted to ask me all along. Would I be their resurrection man? I liked the sound of that. Resurrection Man. If he would have said, Frank, I want you to dig up some corpses out of the graveyard, I don't know if I would have said yes so quickly. But Resurrection Man had a certain ring to it. Besides, I was to be paid handsomely for supplying the anatomical inventory. $5 for a large, 2 and 2 bits for a small. And I would be given sleeping quarters in the basement, 2 hot meals, morning and night. By October 1812, Davidge Hall was open. And in the gloomy spaces beneath the risers were the quarters that I occupied and the quarters of a young medical student named Fettes. Fettes went with me on my first night raid. Well, it was a cool and foggy October evening. Fettes and I, we snuck out of that secret entrance behind Davidge Hall. We headed 2 blocks north, right here, the old Westminster Burying Grounds. Of course, at that time, wasn't a church here at all. It was just an open boneyard. Well, there we were, Fettes and me. It was just our fish oil lanterns to cast a dull glow. Well, we found the grave in question, an old woman who had died the day before. Well, you know, the digging was much, much easier than I had anticipated, since the earth had recently been dug was still loose. And at a depth of 5 or 6 feet, I heard a sound that was to become music to my ears. Now, it was at this point that Fettes and I, we stopped and we wiped our brows, we contemplated the rest of our labor, and it was at this point that I realized we had wasted much time in unearthing the entire grave. Well, it would be much quicker just to open a hole at the head of the grave. With my mattock, I could easily break through the coffin liner and lid, and with my meat hook simply, well, it is rather difficult to explain, really. I think you had to be there. But perhaps I could give you a demonstration. If I could have a volunteer, please. I only use female volunteers, sorry, no offense. Volunteer, please, of the female persuasion. Volunteer, there we are, right to my side. Come here. There we go. Now, here's what we're going to do. You play the corpse, I will play Frank, and the meat hook will portray itself. Now, as I said, I had already opened a hole at the head of the grave. I tie a rope around the trusty meat hook, and I lower it. Yeah, just so we can see. Just back a little bit. There we go. You don't have to go back too far. I just want to make sure I have a good target. Oh, but put the hands down. See, they never covered their neck. No, I would have been out of that graveyard quickly if they covered their neck. So I would lower the meat hook and get it right in place. By the way, indulge me for a moment, if you would. Just everyone, reach right under here. You feel that little indentation? Well, that's pay dirt. So I would lower the hook down. Make sure it wasn't too far to one side or the other. Try to get it right there in the center so I could grab a hold of a good section of meat and bone. And then Fettes would give me a good strong count of 1. You see, Fettes liked suspense. He always took a long time in between the counts. Where were we? Oh yes, 1, 2, 3, and pull the corpse right out of the grave, doing much less damage than one would anticipate. Give this brave corpse some support for her bravery. Thank you, young lady. Well, this was in fact a trick I learned somewhat later on, so at this point, well, Fettes and me, we pried open the coffin lid, rooted the dead woman from her resting place. We inserted the body in the dripping sack and then refilled the grave. Then we took our prize to Davidge Hall. Later that morning, the fruit of our labors was subjected to further indignities in front of a class of gaping medical school students. Such was the beginning of my new career, at least once a week, often even more. I raided the Baltimore boneyard. Now, by and large, these raids were performed without incident. My graveside manner improved. to the point that I could be in and out within a half an hour. This was not easy, you see, because in addition to being quick, I also had to be careful. Every grave watch thought that the grave had been tampered, a thing that made it very difficult for the doctors, the students, and myself. So I learned several tricks, and you won't find these in any books. This information is all passed down through oral tradition, you see. Well, one thing I would do is bring a canvas sheet with me, lay it out, shuffle all the dirt onto the sheet. When I was finished, dump that dirt back into the grave. Then you couldn't tell that it had been dug. Occasionally, well, you see, it was not a good idea to go directly from the graveyard, any graveyard, back to Davidge Hall. Even in a sack, a corpse makes a very suspicious-looking bundle. So often I would ditch my prize in some out-of-the-way place, come back later on, retrieve it. But once, and this is a true story, once I snuck past a night watchman by dressing the corpse in my coat and in my hat and pretending he was a drunk but living companion. But come on now, Bartleby, you'll catch your death out here with no clothes on. Oh yes, we did have some good times in the boneyard, yes we did.